For those who retire early, like my early retirement at 53, it puts you in a position where a lot of people start asking questions. What do you do? What do you do every day? What kind of job do you have? What kind of career do you have? And you really don't have a way to answer that, because a lot of people just look at you with this sort of stunned look in your face when you say, I don't have a job, I'm not working. But you're only 50 or 53, right? How do you answer that? There's so many people facing the same conundrum. On the channel here, I have lots of people asking the questions, talking about, sharing their own stories about, retiring early. And I truly believe retiring early, when you're financially set and you have a plan, set of goals for taking care of your own interests while you're retired. But ultimately, a lot of people stare at us with this strange look in your eyes. Now, one thing I learned was when I was younger, I'd say many moons ago, I had an Uncle George who had a stroke at 45 years old. And then, unfortunately, he was relegated more or less. He lost feeling in his one leg, one arm, and ultimately, he lost the feeling in one leg, one arm, and he really couldn't move around very good. He pretty much instantly was thrown into retirement. Long term, I didn't know. I was a kid. All I know was Uncle George was always sitting in the chair, and when he had to get up to go to the bathroom, it was always a struggle. He kind of hobbled along, and it was always disheartening, and I never understood that. As a young kid growing up, you look at that Uncle George and you think, how does he do it, and how did that happen, and what's that all about? So naturally, the question, once you're sort of old enough to sort of understand that there's something not quite right, you ask the parents. They say, well, Uncle George had a stroke. He had a stroke at 45, and clearly he didn't have a chance to retire or even work a long career. He pretty much just was thrown into retirement. Well, a lot of times when we go and we retire, sometimes it's by choice. Sometimes we decide, we plan, whether it's the FIRE movement, whether we just decide, you know what, I've made some good successful moves in my time and I'm just going to call it quits. Whatever the reason is, there are many people that do retire early, and early retirement could be anywhere from, 30s, 40s, but it could even be 55. It might even be 60, because in most countries, retirement is 65, 67. And did you realize, I read a statistic the other day, in China, it looks like men retire on average, the average retirement age there is 60 for men and 55 for ladies. So it seems like the Western culture has got things a little bit flipped. I talked to somebody that I used to work with many moons ago at the last organization, and he chuckled, and we used to talk. He said, why do we have a society where we have to give our best years to these companies and then only retire, settle down, relax for the last few bad years when we're rough, we're not feeling good? Why don't we give them the worst years of our life? Why isn't the system reverse engineered so that the systems allow you to thrive, build a business, whatever, or as many people do, rely somewhat on the state, however it looks, in the early part of life, or at least on the front end of your life. I'll throw a number out there. Let's say till 40, 50 years old, and then you start giving into this 40-hour work week as you finish off your career. Because they don't want to. They want to consume you at your best, your sharpest, your thinking, your physical. I get it. That's what they want. They want the best that you can provide. That's why most of these organizations run performance conversations, run performance metrics, and sit you down once a year and tell you how good you were or how bad you were. So ultimately, we feel like we're giving our best years of our lives to these companies. And so retiring early just feels like an opportunity to maybe take a little bit of that back. Even if you retire at 55, you think about it, most people start working 25, maybe out of college. That's 30 years. So between 30 to 35 years, you've worked. And that's if at 55 if you decide to pull the plug. So for a lot of people, retiring early just makes sense. For me, it makes sense. And while I was basically asked to leave, for the most part, the idea of retiring early just made sense, and I was pretty much prepared to go down that garden path anyway, at some level, at probably 55 to 57 in that range. And I truly believe this. I believe what I'm preaching, because I think that we need to take some of those years back. And I understand it's not for everybody. I know every country has different circumstances. Everybody's lives are a little bit different. Some people, deal with a late in life divorce, which pretty much turns their life upside down. Some people have a health condition that sort of hampers that. Some people have a string of bad luck. Some people's finances just sort of take a tumble and it just didn't work out. And some people just don't plan and they just live day to day. So unfortunately, it changes for everybody. But there's a growing number of people, the FIRE movement, but more importantly, those that may be looking at least retiring at a reasonable age. Maybe 50 is not for everybody. Maybe 60, 62 might be the number. But feels like at 65, you pretty much worked up all your working career just to follow up a year later, and according to WHO, get ill. So we move on. But this goes back to the conversation about what do I tell people now that I'm pretty much retired? Well, we know I've got a side hustle. I've shared that time and time again. Oh, look at this. We had some critter here have a bad day. Look at all the feathers there laying all over the place. That doesn't look like a good experience. Maybe it was dinner for a coyote, I don't know, but certainly there's always wildlife around out here. There's been a few times I've actually come across a coyote he's looked at me, he's turned the other cheek and headed on off. That's not uncommon. I've seen that a few times here now while I'm out walking around. And we have somebody over here talking. It's kind of loud too, so we're always walking, talking, and finding others. And that's always kind of interesting. There's always somebody out here going for a stroll like I am, but none, suffice it to say, we often looked at that Uncle George, and it was with sadness in a lot of ways. And there's one thing that I remember him stating once. He said, "Don't feel bad for me. Don't pity me. I mean, I'm fine. I'm living life. I'm making the best of what I have. I'm making the best of a bad situation, which is there's always worse." And so he sent a message like that. And it really triggered me. It kind of got me thinking, I'm always willing to help. And, he needed a hand opening a door. I'd scoot on over to give him a hand. But at the end of the day, the last thing he wanted was pity. And so the objective is not to expect pity, and it's certainly not to give pity to those that we feel in our own perspective, in our own minds, that maybe aren't necessarily doing as well as they could. And in his mind, he's doing miraculously. I've met people in other circumstances with even worse conditions, and they're making the most out of life, and they're smiling, and they're enjoying life every single day. And to me, those people, all of them, are inspiring. And so initially, when I first saw Uncle George and the fact that, he was pretty much stuck in a rocking chair, and, he clearly was dealing with stroke, the end of what looked to be a severe stroke. It was a situation where, I had to sort of get past that, because when he basically put me in my place and said, "Don't pity me," that was a real eye-opener for me. And so what I'm finding now, when people often ask, "What do you do now that you're 53? Now I'm 54 and very soon to be 55, but what do you do for a living?" Because most people look at me and say, "Okay, clearly you're not young, but you don't look like of retirement age." I've heard this time and time again, and actually even comments in the channel, and I take that as a positive. Some people could take that and say, "Oh, down in the dumpers, everybody's looking down on me because I'm not working, I don't have a job." But see, initially I sort of had a little bit of that thought. See, because there's how can I say this? There's a bit of a shock, okay? When you're initially let go from a company, especially when you have targets and sites and you were moving up and you felt good about maybe not the total work environment, because I've expressed how that sort of went, but you still took your job very seriously. You did your job to 125% every day. And all of a sudden somebody says, "Yeah, we're good. We don't need you anymore." That sort of does take the wind out of your sails, and there's a bit of a moment of shock. So you go for a period of time where the initial response is, when you talk about a week out, a month out, maybe even 3 or 4 months out, and you get together with, say, some extended family, and they're like, hey, what are you doing these days? What do you tell them? What do you tell people when you're not 70, when you're not 80, but you're 53 or 54? What do you tell people? It almost feels like you have to come up with a storyline, because the society has taught us that to be good little soldiers, we got to be out there marching along to meet the expectations of what society is placing. In other words, you go to school, you get a little bit of education, you get out into the workforce as fast as possible, you buy a house, a car, a picket fence, and a dog, and have a couple of kids. And you do that until you're 67 years old, turn the lights off, and go to sleep. A lot of us do fall victim to that methodology and those theories. You know, I've had some of those aha moments. I've had some triggers in my life. You know, my father passing away during the sea, remember? Back in 2000 when that crap all happened? And we couldn't see him. He was locked down in that old folks home, which we checked him in a couple years earlier because, you know, I was a little bit more remote. My mother was getting sick and she couldn't handle him. He had a severe gait and he wasn't able to help himself. So we put him in an extended care home. And then come during, you know, the demic, if you will. And lo and behold, all of a sudden, 2000 rolls around and we kind of suffered through that. Then they isolated us. We couldn't see him for months. They actually would pull us up, and I would say at least kudos to the folks that were working there. They were great people, very helpful, and they did their best to organize and arrange meetings via, not a Skype, but some sort of meeting, you know, with our phones. They would put an iPhone in, or a touchpad or something in front of them, maybe an iPad, and they would do a kind of a weekly chat or a daily chat. And unfortunately, at this point, he wasn't really able to talk or communicate. So it was really more or less me doing most of the talking. But after going through that, followed by watching a severe decline of my mother, and of course, exactly almost to the day, very soon, coming up right away, my mother passed away almost a year ago today. It was devastating. So you're going through all this shock, all this change happening all at once, and it's a lot to make a lot of people just break down severely. I just want to say cry. You know, I come from kind of the background. I've expressed how, you know, I come from a farming background. My dad was tough. He was tough love, and he was a strong old guy. But you know what? You know, I'll be honest. It comes from a time and a culture in his space where men didn't cry. And if they did, they kind of did it on their own. So when I got my walking papers, you know, the first response was a little bit shock. The secondary to that, when people ask me what do I do, the people that weren't directly in my space, how do you answer that? I was all over the map, but if there's one thing that was consistent was I don't have a job. So then everybody starts looking at you like, what, old Uncle George? You know, that person that just sits around in the chair, you know, limited by something. In this case, you know, he was a stroke survivor, a severe stroke survivor. But, you know, people look, and in some cases, people kind of looked at that with some pity. And so I still have a little bit of this residual, even though I was taught not to pity, I still had some of this residual feelings about, was I maybe a little embarrassed? Was it a little bit awkward? You know, when people ask you and you're only in your early 50s and no, I don't have a job. Are you looking? No. It just became awkward. What do you say to that? Well, I learned it didn't take long. And you know, I started this channel a while back last year, and I started it sort of in the summer, actually around that time. And you saw how upbeat I was, and I truly was. And a lot of that was reactive to, I've finally broken the chains, and I truly believe that. But there were still some of these underlying issues that were still just hanging around. these ideas that I should be working, but I'm not. And I think there's a little bit of that. When you retire early, there's always the societal expectations that we should be working. I mean, we should be working till we're 65, right? And then have that barbecue, the hat, and the Rolex watch, or Timex watch, usually. And then out the door we go. There's those expectations. And if you fall short of that, then people start asking their questions. They raise their eyebrows and they're wondering, what's wrong with you? Is there something wrong? Do you have an ailment or something? What's going on? Nope. See, the advantage I had was a little bit of the social media, and I still continue doing that. So that's an outlet for me to not just generate a little bit of revenue, to sort of replace a little bit of maybe what was removed. But a lot of it more really was just to give myself a sense of schedule, a sense of a little bit of occasion, a little bit of a motivation to get up and do something, to be, to have something to live for, to have something to move on for, to have something that drives me to even keep the brain sharp. Because that's the other thing, even retiring early, there's lots of studies out there that show inactivity and reduction in the exercising of your brain and your thoughts and your calculated ideas, and constantly getting your brain just troubleshooting and problem solving will lead to an early decline. I mean, we saw that with my dad for the last few years. We know he had, a dementia, but it seemed like once he sort of settled down and he took his second retirement session, that's when it really went downhill, because he was still kind of working and he still seemed pretty much with it. But then there was a decision somewhere out of the blue where he just decided, no, enough was enough. And honestly, then it was just all downhill, and it was very quick and rapid. So if there's one thing that I've learned is be proud, wear those stripes. If you get in an accident or an injury, maybe as a kid, you get an owie on your leg and you have to go in for stitches. You have a scar, and that scar there is for life. But I look at that scar as a badge of honor, because it's a sign. It's essentially a tattoo that says, look, I was busy, I was enjoying life, I was growing up, and sure, I got bumps and bruises, but I enjoyed my life every step of the way. And that's one thing, that I live life every step of the way. I enjoy. I don't waste a day, I don't waste a moment. The only time is wasted is a time sleeping. Of course, we all need to rest, we all need to eat. But I believe that, life is precious. And don't be embarrassed. I actually have this guy that I know. I went to visit him once, a while back. And we were friends for many, many years. All of a sudden, he seems like he's mingling with, folks from, I guess if you say a higher financial class, higher society, if you will. I wasn't, I was not at the level of big business owners per se, or, dentists and surgeons. I mean, I consider that, another level in terms of, if you want to talk about society's pecking order. Very, very respectful careers. But this individual walked in who was a seasoned dentist and surgeon and specialist in his field. And he walked into the room, and this guy that I knew for years, I've known him for 32 years. He introduced us. He introduced me. He said, Mark, this is so-and-so. Here's the car he drives. And then when he mentioned to the other guy, this is my electrician here. Yeah, he's just doing a little job for me. That's how I was introed in. And so it felt like there was a factor of he was embarrassed to be associated with somebody who works with their hands. Like, that was a literal, one of my kids was with me that day. I didn't even say anything. When we left, 20 minutes, half hour later, that was one of the first comments out of their mouth. They said, I thought you guys were friends. I didn't even go on about it. This is an observation by a young person that was only 14 years of age or 15 years of age. Said, I thought you guys were friends. You've known him for a long time. Why did he just call you just as a, he didn't refer to you even as your friend or your buddy? No, rather your electrician, which in itself is great. It's a very respectful career, electrical and engineering and all of that. But placing sort of this assignment to a title that I had seemed to be the course of action. Rather, could have been, hey, this is my buddy Mark. Yeah, he's got a fun car too, or this or that. Yeah, he's just doing some wiring here for me. No, could have been a very much more, open and fruitful conversation. Rather, it was one which it seemed was based on a little bit of isolation, maybe a removal from, I've hired him, he's my electrician. When my kid mentioned that, and when we were leaving and we were driving away in the truck, and I thought, you know what, you're right. I never really thought of it that way, but it did sort of feel awkward, like he wasn't really presenting as, a couple of friends. So what I'm trying to get at is, what I'm finding these days is retiring early, and you no longer have that title. People want to label you in their own way for some reason. But that's what I'm trying to do, is fight the labels. I don't need labels. I'm doing my thing. And I think we all should just be thinking about our own work-life balance. And we all have to work for a living. All I'm saying is, if you don't necessarily need to and you're doing it because you don't know what else to do, I just got to remind, life is short, and certainly working is a way for people to feel like they are something. That label means something to them. But when somebody asks me at a social gathering, what do you do? What are you doing? And I do social media. Oh, so you just play on computer all day. That's just how it goes. What do you all have to say? If, maybe some of you are early retireds. Somebody asks you, what do you do? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd like to hear everybody's thoughts. Even those that aren't retired or maybe thinking about this very conversation, because it's a thing. What if you're retired at 64? A slightly early retirement. Do you just say you're retired? Because as soon as, if you say you're retired, I don't even really openly say it a lot in social circles, because it feels like as soon as I do that, it's like Uncle George.